He made his way along the corridor from his office quickly, slowing as he noticed the impact where Joe had bounced from the wall in his final blind dash to him. He glanced back to his door, and then back to the impact before continuing. How did he cause such damage to the wall? He thought, as he began his descent of the stairs, before his mind called him back to the fact Joe was now metal, and he nodded to himself as though it was something normal. He slowed again almost immediately at the sight of the splintered boards, and his first step creaked ominously. Joe, what happened to you? Descent was made as quickly as he could whilst avoiding the clearly damaged stairs, and then he continued on his way, all the time watching his footing and noticing impacts with the walls. His sight must have been fading, maybe his balance too, his mind offered. And for once there was no flight of fancy about it. He was glad, as although he so very much needed to get away from what he had just witnessed, it meant that perhaps his mind was where he was too for once, wanting answers. He noted the impact at the foot of the second stairs, and the damage to the plaster a clearly hand-sized object had made, as well as the slight twisting of the handrail too. Joe had never been this strong, so how? Finally, as he reached the doors to the workshop, he could hear something inside whirring away, and he slowed to a standstill as he peered in through the dusty glass at the top of the doors. All he could see was the usual dim light and familiar benches and tooling, but the noise that drew him was quickly apparent. The drill was spinning at high speed in its pedestal mount, as though it had been raised waiting for a new target to be placed for it to do what it was made for. Joe must have left it on when it ran to him, he thought, but as he pushed the doors open he couldn't understand just why any of this had taken place, and as he walked across the workshop floor he felt a coldness at his chest. He reached inside his shirt and pulled out a trinket that had been given to him by his mother when she had passed, another of the many gifts from his grandfather. It was icy cold to the touch, but there was no logical reason as to why it was suddenly so cold, cold enough to hurt, and it seemed to be humming as though working. Upon closer inspection, he realized the intricate tiny engine was moving. It was moving! He had never seen it do this before, and for a brief moment he was distracted from the events that had transpired as he turned it over and tried to work out how it was doing what it was doing. After all, there was no power for it. It was just a pendant, something to wear. Yet despite logic telling him it could not, it most definitely was turning. He reached the drill, the smell of its burning motor evident, and upon pushing the stop button he felt the gearing grinding to a welcome halt. This must have been on for hours, he reasoned, as he scanned the machine bed. On the top lay several pieces of his own design, crafted from his patented alloy. What were you making, Joe? He wondered, as he looked them over. Yes, they were indeed his designs, only slightly altered. But to what end? He turned them over as he glanced around the room, his gaze being drawn to a car chassis that was covered with a strange gearing, and all these altered components, made from his alloy. So, you were making something here, he said, as he moved over to it to begin examining them, only to find they were in motion. Something about the movement made him freeze for a moment, chills shooting up his spine, as he was sure he had seen them before. But how? This was all new to him, so how could he? Marco then noticed that the air seemed to be somehow thicker, or at least hindering his movement, as though a large fan were directed at him, and he looked around, trying to discover the source. It was then he realized the machine had a seat, a literal driver's seat. The car's original one, he wagered, and he circled the car to get a better view, and upon reaching it he got another shiver, and felt he had seen this before too. The trinket he was still holding was still whirring, and still icy cold. He lifted it back around his neck, hanging it outside of his shirt so as not to be shocked by the coldness, and leant in to examine this strangely constructed machine more closely. A car, with many sliding discs where the radio would have been, and what looked like flywheel catchers lined up above them. And there, between the discs and the catchers, he saw a recess. Immediately he got flashes of Joe placing the battery he had taken from his dead hands into the recess, and he saw the arcing lights for the second time as he relived the memory. He pulled back from the machine, shaking his head and staring at the recess. The images faded quickly, but as he looked up, more images began to seep to the fore, Joe moving the discs and of an all-encompassing sound. "The universal antenna," he said quietly, as he began to slowly remember what he had seen, what he had experienced, the weather station, and the sounds of the solar system. He found himself weeping at the recollections, Joe all too alive in them. But when? When was this? Why had he not remembered before? What was going off? Was his mind playing tricks on him again, or had he truly somehow forgotten all of this? He climbed into the seat slowly, and felt his hand drawn to the discs, and he found himself positioning them as Joe had done, in order to hear the weather. And sure enough, it came through loud and strong. It was true. What he had forgotten? Why had he? Joe had done something amazing here, fantastic in fact. So what was going off, and why couldn't he recall anything till now? And more importantly, what had happened to Joe? He had to find out, and was sure his memories of this machine must hold the key. And so he began to focus upon his new memories and enacted what Joe had done. Perhaps the truth lay in what he had been showing him. The weather station left, and the other sounds were quickly found, and then he began reliving the conversations about the machine itself and its history, Joe's family and his grandfather, the stories of the horror and the madness some had been driven to when exposed to the machine. Wait, was this what had happened to Joe? No, it couldn't be. Being a madman did not turn you to metal, of that he was sure, so whatever had transpired had to have something to do with this machine. He began to panic, sweat suddenly pouring down his face, as what had transpired in the office with Joe finally settled in, and he fought to keep it together, gripping the driver's wheels and trying to focus. He began to slowly pull at his memories, racking his mind as he tried to remember, but all he could think of was Joe, in his death throes in the office. And then he began to remember the little pieces between the grand ones. Joe had not known about the battery, but had built the recess anyway. He had said it was built to specifications he had, and that his grandfather's work in mechanical pieces had allowed him to complete it. Marco's alloy had been incorporated, and the pieces remade to better do whatever their jobs were. Marco was confused, but his engineering mind saw a plan, a schematic, an engineered happening. Joe had followed instructions given by voices from God knows where, to rebuild what he had once seen as a child, and somehow his grandfather had had a hand in the disassembling of it. Those pieces had been wrapped and given to him, and in turn to Joe, to recreate what once had been. But to what end? Joe had said the voices were kind-hearted and benevolent, nurturing and welcoming, and then suddenly they were arranging a coincidence on a scale that made his head hurt. So Joe had been sent to him somehow, to be reunited with the pieces, to remake what once was, also he could continue talking with the voices from his childhood. Something seemed strange with this. As the memories continued, he eventually began to remember that something had happened after the yellow battery had been placed in the recess, outside of the arcing lights. Joe had tuned the antenna to the voices, but he had heard nothing. And then he couldn't recall as hard as he tried. He pulled out the battery and looked into the recess. Maybe they weren't at their machine when he called, he thought, as he bounced the battery in his hand. Maybe they can tell me what happened to Joe. He sat back in the seat and placed the battery in the recess, and it jumped into place as before, arcing as it did. Immediately the machine began to vibrate differently, and the illusion of wheels moving strangely had him recalling the first time he had seen it as they spanned fast yet backward at the same time. But he was ready for it, and fought back the wave of nausea that came. Then he took a deep breath, and moved the discs to the positions they had been in before, when Joe had dialed the voices in. As soon as they were in position, his chest became cold as his pendant seemingly went into overdrive, and his release of breath could clearly be seen as though on an icy winter's morn. He lifted it away from his chest, and as he did so he heard it. Quiet at first, but raising in intensity slowly. The buzzing he thought at first was from the machine, but as it raised in volume it was clearly coming from all around, and he climbed from the seat and stood back where he had been when listening to the other sounds from the antenna previously. So, where were the voices? He glanced around and shouted, "Where are your voices?" The buzzing ceased immediately and was replaced with silence, as though an amplifier had been turned up in volume, giving a low crackling background hiss of nothing. "Well, what happened to Joe?" he insisted, raising his voice a little as, from what he could see, something had taken notice of him and stopped the other noise. He had their attention. "Well?" The background hiss grew in volume before being replaced with a voice. "You can hear us now." Marco shrugged as the voice seemed to invade his head from all sides at once, wincing as it hit him. "Perhaps we made an error." The voice stopped suddenly. Marco looked around as it broke off, his hand moving away from his replaced pendant, now cold enough to tolerate again. "Are you still there?" he said loudly, spinning around. Silence. Not even the hissing static was heard. He took a step back to where he had stood initially and called out, "Is this a better spot for you?" Silence again. He stood as he looked around, glancing back to the machine, and he found himself turning the pendant over in his fingers, and as he did he heard broken words. "Human, 1-4. I see. Your trinket blocks our communication. Unforeseen." "Unforeseen? You mean as in you had plans?" Marco asked slowly. "Yes, you were chosen to carry forth our word, but we had to use a lesser vessel." And with that his mind was assaulted with imagery of Joe, and the memory of his last encounter with him was now his. Marco reeled as it hit him, and he released the pendant, their voices vanishing once more. He stood still as the memories played out. The laying out of the past, the plans, the usurping of the identities of the original voices, and ultimately what they had given to Joe. He was angry. So very angry. He had discovered what had been done to Joe, who had done it, and he was being told it was supposed to be him. His inability to be their host because he was broken had ended Joe. But what the hell were they? He wanted them to pay for their acts upon his friend, and again his mind was not making light of the matter, instead keeping him focused, so he lifted the pendant slowly. "What the hell are you?" Marco asked, his anger wanting to come forth, but it had nowhere to go, nothing to lash at. "We are the voices Joe needed." "You destroyed that man!" Marco cried out. "No, we merely gave him our gift. He was to be the first, as you have now seen and heard, to guide us to you." And with that the voice changed to the darker one that had been heard in those memories. "To all of you." "No, I won't let that happen," Marco shouted back. "And what can the descendants of our pawns and plans possibly do to stop us? You are powerless to prevent that which is coming." A long pause of silence played out before they finished with a resounding "Yes." Marco could feel them trying to push themselves into his mind, insect noises starting, along with rending metal and twisting cables. He dropped the pendant again, and it all stopped, silent once more. He could stop them, using him at least, and it was all because of this trinket that his grandfather had made. Wait, if he had made this, he must have known it worked, so how had he figured it out? They would never have given such knowledge or power from what he had seen and been exposed to. So who? Or perhaps he had never heard these voices. Perhaps the others? No matter right now, as he had a machine to stop. He ran to the car, pendant bouncing from him with every step, their voices ringing between the bouncers as he moved along.
It is too late, Marco.
He reached the car and circled it to the driver's side.
You cannot stop us.
He slid into the seat hurriedly, his hair snagging on his pendant.
We are already coming.
He spanned the disc to their starting position, and as he grabbed and yanked the battery from the recess, he heard their words once more.
We thank you, Marco. We will see you in time.
He quickly disentangled his pendant from his hair as the last words fell.
Soon, Marco.
And peace landed hard upon him as he slumped triumphantly into the seat. He was a mess. Feelings of success and anger, sorrow and rage swirled as he caught his breath, and he looked down at his hands as they held the battery loosely. He had turned off the antenna, Joe's machine, and that meant they had no guiding beacon any longer, since he had now removed their power source. But Joe... He ripped the ignition from the car as he emerged from the machine, and threw the key into a metal box that contained hundreds of other keys and scrap metal pieces. Just to be sure, he thought, as he headed back towards his office, to his fallen friend, Joe.